In the midst of the most devastating war in human history, a different kind of battle was unfolding, one not fought with tanks or rifles, but with dignity, courage, and the unshakable will to be seen as equal. While Allied forces clashed with tyranny across Europe and the Pacific, Black American soldiers faced another enemy much closer to home: systemic racism embedded deep within their own military. Imagine volunteering to defend a country that refuses to defend your rights. Picture yourself standing in uniform, ready to risk everything for the nation's freedom, only to be told you are not fit to fight on the front lines, not because of your training or your ability, but because of the color of your skin. During World War II, over 1 million African Americans served in the U.S. military, yet they were kept in segregated units, often relegated to labor battalions, cooks, truck drivers, and stevedores, jobs deemed suitable for black men by a government that still considered them second-class citizens. They trained in separate facilities, ate in different mess halls, and bled on the battlefield only to return home to a country that denied them basic civil rights. But even within these confines, they rose. They defied expectations. They broke barriers. From the Tuskegee Airmen soaring across European skies to the 761st Tank Battalion punching through Nazi defenses, these soldiers proved their worth not just with bullets, but with unwavering courage and quiet defiance. This is the story of the forgotten warriors, the men who fought 2 wars at once, one against fascism abroad, the other against racism at home. It is a story of injustice, yes, but more importantly, a story of resilience, of honor, and of a legacy too long overlooked. Today, we will take you deep into the hidden chapters of World War II history, through personal stories, powerful archives, and long-suppressed truths. We will uncover how black soldiers helped shape the outcome of the war, and how their service sparked the early flames of the civil rights movement back home. If you are passionate about history that challenges what we think we know about courage in the face of injustice and truth that demands to be told, then this is the story for you. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another untold chapter of history. Your support helps us bring forward the voices that history tried to silence. Let's begin. Black servicemen were often denied proper combat training and were assigned to labor-intensive jobs, such as truck driving and supply transport. This was not by accident, but by design. The military structure of World War II mirrored the deep racial divides of American society at the time. While the war was being fought abroad to defeat fascism and defend democratic ideals, at home and within the military, African Americans were subjected to a system that viewed them as less capable, less trustworthy, and ultimately, less human. Most black soldiers were pushed into the Army Service Forces, a branch that handled logistics, loading cargo, transporting supplies, maintaining vehicles. These were essential duties, critical to the functioning of the war machine, but they were rarely celebrated. There were no headlines or medals for those who ensured the ammunition reached the front lines or the food got to starving troops. And yet, these soldiers worked tirelessly, often under harsh conditions, knowing their efforts made victory possible. One of the largest examples of this was the Red Ball Express, a massive supply chain run primarily by African American drivers, moving goods from the beaches of Normandy to the fast-advancing front lines after D-Day. These convoys ran day and night on narrow, torn roads, often targeted by German snipers or sabotaged by mines. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and rarely recognized. Still, the men of the Red Ball Express kept driving. The irony was brutal. Many of these soldiers had volunteered to fight, believing that serving their country might finally earn them equality or at least respect. But instead of rifles, they were given shovels, Instead of a place in combat units, they were handed broomsticks and told to sweep the barracks. The official reasoning was that black men were unfit for leadership or too emotional for battle. These racist assumptions were baked into training programs, command structures, and policies that systematically kept black troops out of harm's way and out of glorious path. This exclusion extended beyond training and assignments. Black servicemen often lived in worse conditions, received fewer supplies, and were punished more harshly than their white counterparts. In camps across the US and Europe, there were separate mess halls, separate latrines, and even separate blood banks because it was believed that black and white blood should not mix. Yet, despite all this, many black soldiers held their heads high. They still performed their duties with discipline and dedication. They still believed in the promise of a better America. Even as they were denied the full rights of citizenship, they still hoped that their sacrifice in war might help build peace at home. And then there were the moments of confrontation. Black soldiers who dared to question the system, who resisted unfair treatment or spoke out against injustice, were often met with swift and harsh discipline. Some were imprisoned. Some were dishonorably discharged. Some were attacked by fellow soldiers. In one harrowing instance, black troops returning from Europe were lynched while still in uniform. The uniform they had worn in service of their country became a target on their backs. But the resilience of these men cannot be overstated. They forged ahead. They wrote letters home, keeping morale alive among their families. They sent money back to communities that were watching and waiting for their return. And many found ways to support each other, building networks of solidarity within the ranks, protecting younger soldiers from the worst abuses, and mentoring one another in whatever ways they could. Their courage was not just in enduring the battlefield, it was in surviving a system designed to break them. And slowly, the cracks began to show in that system. Stories of black heroism like that of Dory Miller, who manned anti-aircraft guns during Pearl Harbor without formal training and saved countless lives, began to circulate. The Tuskegee Airmen defied every stereotype, flying missions with excellence and changing perceptions in the process. Pressure began to mount from civil rights organizations back home, demanding that the nation live up to the ideals it claimed to defend. The double victory campaign, victory abroad and victory at home, became a rallying cry. African American newspapers, churches, and civil groups began documenting the achievements and mistreatment of black servicemen. They highlighted the contradictions between fighting for freedom overseas and facing oppression in the barracks. By the end of the war, over 1 million African Americans had served in the U.S. military. Their contribution was undeniable, and while full disaggregation would not come until 1948, with President Truman's Executive Order 9981, the efforts and sacrifices of these men had already planted the seeds of change. Their labor behind the scenes, their perseverance in the face of humiliation, their quiet heroism, all of it laid the groundwork for the civil rights battles that would follow. They showed America what loyalty looked like under fire, not just from an enemy abroad, but from injustice at home. In remembering their stories, we honor more than just history. We confront the complexity of patriotism, the pain of exclusion, and the power of perseverance. The black servicemen of World War II may have been denied frontline glory, but they were the backbone of the Allied victory. Their hands turned the wheels of war, and their spirit helped bend the arc of history just a little closer to justice. Even overseas, far from the land that had shaped their struggle, black American soldiers found that the shadow of racism followed them across the Atlantic. They had sailed thousands of miles, leaving behind a country that rarely treated them as equals, hoping perhaps naively that in Europe, their uniforms might finally command the respect they deserved. But the illusion of sanctuary was shattered quickly. Even in war zone, where the enemy wore different colors and flew different flags. The fight for dignity was never far from the surface. For many black servicemen, France seemed at first like a different world, one where skin color did not dictate where they could sit, eat, or sleep. Local civilians often greeted them with curiosity, sometimes even admiration, recognizing their American accents and their crisp military uniforms. There are letters and diaries where black soldiers wrote about being welcomed into French homes, offered food, drink, and conversation without the usual tension that came with being black in America. For a fleeting moment, some felt what it was like to be judged for who they were, not for the color of their skin. But those moments were the exception, not the rule. As the months passed and more American troops arrived, it became clear that racial lines were being redrawn across European soil not by the French, but by the Americans themselves. White officers often cautioned French civilians, particularly women, against interacting too closely with black soldiers. They spread warnings, some subtle, others overt, framing these servicemen as dangerous, undisciplined, or morally corrupt. It was a distortion rooted in centuries of prejudice, now exported overseas as part of the American military presence. The American command even took formal steps to enforce segregation in towns near military installations. In some cases, they attempted to establish separate clubs, recreation areas, and even curfews for black troops. The rationale offered was order and discipline. But to the men affected, it was just another reminder that their sacrifice was being undervalued, even mocked. They were risking their lives in the same trenches, facing the same bullets and artillery shells. But off the battlefield, they were treated as if they belonged to a lower caste. The resentment this created among black soldiers was not always loud, but it ran deep. Letters sent home often spoke of frustration and fatigue, not just from the war effort, but from the battle to retain their self-worth. One soldier wrote, "The Germans are the enemy, but it is the people in my own uniform that make me feel like a stranger." Another recounted how a white officer reprimanded him for simply walking alongside a French woman, accusing him of disgracing the uniform. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern, a deliberate effort to remind black servicemen of their place, even in foreign lands. And yet, despite these daily humiliation, many black troops carried themselves with quiet pride. They understood that their service was more than just a military duty, it was a statement. Every time they completed a supply mission under fire, every time they dug trenches in bitter cold or transported the wounded through shell-shattered landscapes, they were proving a point. They were challenging the lie that patriotism had a color, that courage came with conditions. Some found a strange kind of solace in knowing that history would remember them not just as victims of injustice, but as participants in one of the most consequential struggles of the 20th century on two fronts, one against fascism abroad, the other against racism at home. Their presence in Europe also created ripples that would last far beyond the war. In towns across France, Belgium, and Italy, local populations witnessed firsthand the contradiction between the values America claimed to uphold and the way it treated its own soldiers. There were French mayors who wrote to American commanders protesting the mistreatment of black troops. There were civilians who defended them, who opened their homes when American barracks closed their doors. These acts of kindness, small as they may have seemed, became stories passed down through generations. Reminders that empathy could cross language and national barriers, even when official policies refused to. But perhaps the most tragic irony was this. For some black soldiers, returning to America after the war felt like a defeat. They came back decorated with medals, letters of commendation, and stories of valor, only to be forced through colored-only entrances at train stations. They were denied mortgages, job opportunities, and basic civil rights in the very nation they had helped defend. The contrast was staggering. In Europe, they had glimpsed a different world, one where they could walk freely, be greeted with a handshake rather than suspicion. Back home, they were reminded that uniform or not, they were still seen as second-class citizens. Yet in that disillusionment, seeds of change were planted. The experiences of black servicemen overseas, both the brief moments of equality and the bitter betrayals, would become a rallying point for a future generation. They had seen what was possible, and they would not forget. When the civil rights movement gathered momentum in the 1950s and 60s, many of its leaders had worn the uniform in World War II. They had learned discipline, resilience, and courage not just from military training, but from the lived experience of being black and American in a world that constantly tried to deny their humanity. In the end, the story of these soldiers is not just about war. It is about identity, sacrifice, and the quiet rebellion of existing with dignity in a system designed to strip that dignity away. They may not have been treated as heroes by all, but they acted like heroes nonetheless, and in doing so, they forced the world to confront a painful truth, that even in the fight for freedom, not all men were free. While the world's attention was fixed on the global struggle against tyranny during World War II, a different kind of war raged within the hearts of many African Americans, a war fought not with bullets, but with conviction, resilience, and a vision for justice, as black soldiers enlisted to serve in the U.S. military. They did so not only with a commitment to defend democracy abroad, but also with a deep awareness that the very freedoms they were prepared to die for were still denied to them. At home, this painful contradiction gave birth to a powerful and unprecedented movement within black communities across the United States. The Double Victory Campaign, coined by the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the leading African American newspapers of the time. The campaign captured a sentiment that was rapidly spreading across segregated neighborhoods, church gatherings, barbershops, and school classrooms. It called for two simultaneous victories, one against fascism overseas and another against the entrenched racism and discrimination that defined daily life in America. The idea resonated powerfully with young black men and women who understood that wearing a uniform did not shield them from prejudice. They hoped their military service might finally earn them full citizenship in the nation they helped defend. Yet, reality was harsh. Black troops were often relegated to labor battalions or assigned to menial tasks, even while fighting in some of the most dangerous theaters of war. The Tuskegee Airmen, for example, had to prove over and over again that they were just as capable and courageous as any white pilot. In the Pacific and European fronts, black units like the 92nd Infantry Division and the 761st Tank Battalion faced not only the enemy but also the skepticism of their own commanders. The irony was glaring. These men risked their lives to defeat racial ideologies abroad, only to be treated as second-class citizens by the army they served. Back home, the families of these soldiers carried their own burdens. Wives, mothers, and sisters who contributed to the war effort in factories or volunteered in local defense organizations were often denied equal pay and recognition. In many towns, black families were excluded from war bond drives or public commemorations. And yet, they pressed on, sending letters, organizing fundraisers, sharing stories of heroism from the front lines, and refusing to be silent. The Double Victory Campaign was more than a slogan, it was a call to conscience. It became a rallying cry for a generation determined to challenge the hypocrisy of American democracy. Rallies were held, editorials were written, radio broadcasts amplified voices that had long been ignored. The campaign forged alliances with labor unions, civil rights organizations, and progressive white Americans who began to question the contradictions in their country's moral stance. For many returning black veterans, the end of the war marked not a period of rest, but the beginning of a new phase in their struggle. They came home with medals and military honors, only to be denied jobs, housing, and even the right to vote in some states. In uniform, they were symbols of victory. Out of uniform, they were once again targets of segregation and violence. Some were lynched. Others were beaten simply for wearing their service attire in public. But these brutal realities did not silence the growing determination within black communities. The resolve forged during wartime began to coalesce into what would later become the civil rights movement. Organizations like the NAP saw membership surge during and after the war, as veterans and their families demanded the rights they had been promised. The GIBIL, intended to support all returning servicemen, became another battleground black veterans had to fight for their share of education and housing benefits, often facing discriminatory practices that kept them from building generational wealth. Even in popular culture, the echoes of the Double Victory campaign could be felt. Writers, poets, and musicians used their platforms to express both pride and protest. Langston Hughes, in his poignant war poems, captured the double burden of black soldiers. Jazz and blues carried the pain, hope, and fire of a people who refused to be forgotten. Visual artists painted murals and posters that depicted black heroes not as caricatures, but as defenders of freedom and justice. The campaign also inspired future leaders. A young Martin Luther King Jr., still in seminary during the war, would later cite the valor and struggle of black veterans as a key influence on his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Thurgood Marshall, then working as a civil rights attorney, used war-era momentum to challenge school segregation and workplace discrimination, paving the way for landmark victories in the years to come. In retrospect, the Double Victory campaign stands as a testament to the unwavering hope and strategic brilliance of black Americans during one of the most turbulent eras in history. They understood that true victory required more than the defeat of foreign dictators. It demanded the transformation of their own country. Their fight, born in the shadows of battlefields and ignited by the contradictions of wartime patriotism, lit the torch for a new era of civil rights. Though the path remained long and filled with obstacles, the campaign's legacy endured. It shaped a narrative of resistance rooted not in bitterness, but in the belief that America could one day live up to its highest ideals. And as the world celebrated the end of global war, a quieter, more enduring battle continued, one that sought not just liberty from tyranny, but justice from within. During World War II, as the world teetered between tyranny and freedom, a battle of a different kind unfolded on American soil, a struggle not just for global victory, but for justice and dignity within the borders of the very country waging war for liberty abroad. Amid this complex backdrop, the Tuskegee Airmen emerged not just as pilots in the sky, but as symbols of defiance against a deeply entrenched system of racial inequality. These men, all black and all volunteers, dared to claim a place in a military institution that had long excluded them from meaningful roles. Their fight was not only against foreign enemies, but also against the expectations and prejudices of their own government and fellow citizens. At a time when the U.S. military was strictly segregated, the idea that black men could become fighter pilots was met with intense skepticism and resistance. Military officials, politicians, and even segments of the general public questioned their abilities, often hiding racist beliefs behind pseudoscientific claims about intellect and temperament. But in Tuskegee, Alabama, a program was quietly being developed to test the very boundaries of these assumptions. It began as an experiment, some might say a reluctant concession, but it soon became a movement. The Tuskegee program was rigorous and demanding. The men who entered it knew they were under constant scrutiny every test flight. Every landing, every maneuver in the air would either reinforce or dismantle the barriers of prejudice. The airmen trained under harsh conditions, with limited resources and constant reminders that failure would not be seen as individual, but collective, reflecting not on one pilot, but on the entire black race. Yet they excelled. With every passing week, they transformed from cadets into disciplined aviators, mastering the intricacies of flight and forming a bond forged in shared purpose and struggle. They knew that what they were doing transcended personal ambition. Every successful mission was a strike against centuries of racist ideology. Every dogfight won was a challenge to the myths that had denied their fathers and grandfathers the right to serve with dignity. When they finally deployed to Europe, the Tuskegee Airmen flew missions that would etch their names into military history. As part of the 332nd Fighter Group, they became known for their discipline in the skies and their reputation for never abandoning the bombers they escorted. In a war defined by uncertainty, they brought dependability. Pilots from the bomber groups began to request the red tails, a nickname derived from the distinct crimson paint on the tails of the Tuskegee planes. That red tail became more than a visual marker, it was a symbol of pride, reliability, and excellence. They flew over 15,000 sorties and destroyed more than 250 enemy aircraft. But their greatest triumph was not just in the number of missions completed or enemy planes downed, it was in the hearts and minds they began to change back home. As news of their success reached American shores, the narrative began to shift. The airmen were no longer just an experiment, they were war heroes. They appeared in newspapers, were referenced in War Department films, and slowly began to reshape public perception. Their achievements gave strength to the broader movement of Black Americans fighting for civil rights. This was the era of the double victory campaign: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home, and the Tuskegee Airmen embodied both battles. They showed that patriotism and protest were not mutually exclusive, and that loyalty to a country did not mean silence in the face of injustice. Their legacy reverberated long after the war ended. The success of the Tuskegee Airmen directly influenced President Harry Truman's decision to desegregate the military in 1948. Their courage and professionalism helped dismantle the flawed logic of segregation within the armed forces and beyond. They became role models, not just for aspiring black pilots, but for all Americans who believed in the principles of merit and equality. Their story served as a powerful rebuttal to the idea that change must be gradual, that opportunity must be earned slowly. These men proved that excellence could not be confined by color, and that the fight for freedom at home was every bit as vital as the battles fought overseas. Even today, their story stands as a testament to perseverance and transformation. Memorials, documentaries, and school curricula now bear their names, ensuring that future generations understand the full scope of their impact, not just as aviators, but as pioneers of justice. Their red-tailed planes have become iconic, featured in airshows and museum exhibits, symbolizing both their tactical achievements and the moral victories they secured. And while many of the airmen have passed on, their legacy continues to fly on the wings of those who followed, and in the conscience of a nation that is still learning to live up to its ideals. In the skies over war-torn Europe, the Tuskegee Airmen carved arcs of defiance and hope. They did not just challenge the Luftwaffe, they challenged America to be better. And in doing so, they did not just win battles, they changed history. In the brutal theaters of World War II, where chaos consumed continents and the cost of freedom was measured in blood, countless acts of heroism illuminated the darkness. Among those unsung for far too long were Black American soldiers who, despite facing systemic racism at home and discrimination within their own military units, stepped into battle with unwavering resolve. They were not only fighting the Axis powers abroad, they were battling for recognition, dignity, and equality within the very country they had sworn to defend. From the beaches of Normandy to the dense jungles of the Pacific, black servicemen took up arms, often relegated to support roles or labor-intensive duties, yet time and again proving that courage knows no color. Units like the 92nd Infantry Division, dubbed the Buffalo Soldiers, fought in Italy under grueling conditions, while the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, charged through Europe alongside General Patton's forces. Their valor in the face of mortal danger did not go unnoticed by those in the trenches with them. But the accolades and honors that should have followed were, for many, shamefully delayed or denied altogether. The military at the time was segregated, and the U.S. government maintained policies that mirrored the racial injustices Black Americans experienced in their everyday lives. This institutional bias permeated decisions at every level, from training opportunities to assignments and, most glaringly, in the recognition of battlefield heroism. While white soldiers who displayed gallantry were often swiftly recommended for medals, black soldiers were routinely overlooked, their deeds dismissed or buried under layers of bureaucratic indifference and prejudice. Take, for instance, the story of Vernon Baker. In April 1945, near Viareggio, Italy, Lieutenant Baker led a daring assault against heavily fortified German positions. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, he took out multiple enemy machine gun nests, rallied his troops, and refused to retreat even after his unit was decimated. His heroism was undeniable, yet for decades, he received no national commendation. It was not until 1997, more than 50 years later, that Baker was finally awarded the Medal of Honor by President Bill Clinton, becoming the only living black World War II veteran to receive the nation's highest military award. For him, and for the families of 6 other black soldiers honored posthumously in that same ceremony, it was a moment of long overdue recognition, shadowed by the sorrow of delay. These belated honors were not anomalies but emblematic of a larger pattern. The systemic exclusion of black soldiers from award recommendations was so entrenched that a Department of Defense review in the 1990s concluded that racial discrimination had been a key factor in the awarding of medals during World War II. It took half a century for the nation to officially acknowledge that truth, but for the soldiers who endured those silent injustices, the scars ran deep. Still, recognition, even if delayed, holds profound meaning. It reshapes the narrative, inserts erased names back into the ledger of history, and affirms the humanity and heroism of those who were denied their due. These medals are more than decorations. They are a testament to perseverance under double burdens, the horrors of war and the sting of racial injustice. Yet even beyond formal awards, the stories of these men endure in the testimonies of their comrades and the families who carried their legacies. In segregated units across the globe, black soldiers demonstrated time and again that patriotism is not defined by the approval of a nation, but by the unshakable commitment to defend its ideals. Even when they are not extended equally, their actions in the field were acts of defiance, resilience, and belief in a better future, one in which their children might not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character and the courage of their actions. In recounting these stories today, we not only correct the record, we elevate it. The bravery of black soldiers in World War II is not an adjunct to the war's history. It is central to it. Their perseverance, both on the battlefield and in the long, painful wait for justice, speaks to the very essence of the American story. The fight to align the nation's practice with its promise. It is a story still being written, as newer generations learn of these men, of their sacrifice, their silence, and their struggle. We inch closer to a fuller, more honest understanding of history, and in doing so, we honor not just their service, but their faith in a nation that would one day, finally, remember their names. In the dark days of World War II, while the world was united against fascism, a quieter, more insidious battle was being fought within the very heart of the American home front, a battle against deeply entrenched racial inequality. Black soldiers, despite being drafted or volunteering to fight for a country that had long denied them equal rights, stepped into the theater of war with courage and an unwavering sense of duty. They did not fight for glory nor recognition, but for the hope that their sacrifice might someday pave the way to a more just nation. Yet, the contradictions of this struggle were glaring, none more so than in the treatment of something as elemental and life-affirming as blood. Blood, the most basic symbol of shared humanity, became another dividing line. Shockingly, during the war, even donated blood was segregated by race. As bombs fell across Europe and the Pacific, and wounded soldiers clung to life on distant battlefields, the life-saving plasma they received was labeled not just with blood type, but with racial classification. This practice was not grounded in science, no medical research justified it. It was rooted in ideology. A stubborn belief in difference where there was none. Black and white Americans bled the same, yet their blood was sorted, separated, and often discarded if the source did not fit the preferred racial profile. This policy did not emerge from battlefield necessity, it came from high-level decisions in military and Red Cross protocols, mirroring the institutional segregation of American society. Black Americans were allowed to give blood, but initially only to other black recipients, as if their contributions were somehow tainted by race. Later, the military reluctantly accepted integrated supplies, but still labeled them to allow for separation. It was a devastating message to those fighting on the front lines that their patriotism, their suffering, their blood, was somehow less American. For black soldiers, this stark contradiction underscored the reality that their service was being asked in a country unwilling to grant them full citizenship. They fought under a flag that flew over segregated schools, housing, and hospitals. Even in death, many were buried in separate cemeteries or had their graves marked differently. And yet, in the face of such systemic disregard, they fought with valor. In Europe, they stormed beaches, defended convoys, and liberated towns. In the Pacific, they endured brutal jungle warfare and relentless enemy assaults. Some were awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military recognition, but too often, their commendations came decades late, withheld by a system slow to acknowledge their worth. Back home, families of black soldiers waited anxiously, not only for news from the front, but for any sign that the nation recognized their loved ones' sacrifices. Mothers who gave their sons to the war effort faced discrimination in wartime employment. Fathers who had served in the previous World War saw history repeating itself. The segregated blood policy became a metaphor for the broader societal rejection they had long endured, a refusal to see them as equal, even in the moments of shared suffering. Stories from the front further laid bare the absurdity of such divisions. Medics, overwhelmed by the wounded, often disregarded segregation protocols in the chaos of battle. In the heat of combat, what mattered was saving lives, not the race of the person bleeding out. In these desperate moments, the policy of blood segregation was revealed for what it was: a cruel, artificial barrier maintained by those far from the front lines. In 1944, a quiet rebellion began to stir within the medical community and among civil rights leaders. Black physicians and nurses, many of whom had been denied positions in white hospitals, spoke out against the practice. Letters were written, protests organized, and journalists began to question the logic behind the Red Cross policy. Some influential figures, including Nobel Prize-winning scientists, called the segregation of blood both scientifically baseless and morally indefensible. Still, change came slowly. The war ended, but the legacy of segregated blood lingered. It was not until 1950 that the Red Cross officially stopped labeling blood by race, a small but symbolic victory in the long march toward equality. Yet for many, the damage had already been done. It had been a vivid illustration of just how deep the roots of racism ran, even in moments meant to unite and heal. But the story does not end in despair. From this painful contradiction came a greater resolve. The experience of black soldiers during World War II of giving blood, fighting battles, and returning to a segregated homeland helped catalyze the burgeoning civil rights movement. Veterans who had been denied equal treatment abroad and at home became some of the most vocal advocates for justice. They carried the memories of war and the bitterness of inequality into the marches of the 1950s and 60s. Their voices were firm, their demands simple. A country that had taken their blood must finally give them their due. In telling this story, we remember not just the heroism of black soldiers on the battlefield, but the quiet heroism of those who challenged injustice at home. We honor those who gave not only their service, but their dignity, in the face of a nation still learning how to see them fully. Their blood was never different. It was the same red river of courage that flowed through every American sacrifice. And in that truth would become impossible to ignore. In the vast machinery of war that mobilized millions across oceans and continents, the U.S. Navy stood as a symbol of might, discipline, and technological advancement. Yet beneath the polished decks and the thunder of cannons lay an unsettling truth. For many black sailors, the fight against tyranny abroad was shadowed by a quieter but equally persistent battle for dignity within their own ranks. While the United States proudly declared itself a defender of freedom in the face of fascism, it continued to enforce a rigid system of racial hierarchy within its armed forces. In the Navy, this manifested most clearly in the roles black men were allowed, or rather, denied the opportunity to perform. Most black sailors in the Navy were confined to one role, that of the steward. Their duties were not on the bridge, steering the ship, nor in the engine room, where technical skill and mechanical mastery kept the vessel alive. Instead, they served meals, made beds, and cleaned the quarters of white officers. These jobs, though vital in their own right, were emblematic of a deeper belief held by those in power, that black men were to serve, not lead, to support, not command. This reality was not hidden. It was policy systemic, deliberate, and public. The story of Doris Miller, a mess attendant turned unexpected hero at Pearl Harbor, is often told as an exception to this rule. When the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941, Miller, a black steward with no formal weapons training, manned an anti-aircraft gun and returned fire with fierce determination. He helped move wounded sailors, including the captain of the USS West Virginia, and showed extraordinary courage in the face of chaos. For his actions, he received the Navy Cross, becoming one of the first African Americans to be so honored. But Miller's bravery, while celebrated, did not change the system. He returned to his role as a steward, and the Navy's policies remained unchanged. His heroism was honored, but his status remained fixed. Even as the war intensified and the need for skilled personnel grew, black sailors continued to be denied access to technical training programs and combat roles. This exclusion was not based on capability, it was rooted in prejudice. The military, reflecting the broader norms of American society at the time, operated on the assumption that black men were less intelligent, less capable, and less trustworthy in positions of responsibility. Promotions for black sailors were rare, and when they did occur, they were often capped by a glass ceiling that kept them from ascending into true leadership roles. This systemic limitation did not go unnoticed by those affected. Many black servicemen expressed frustration and humiliation at being forced to serve meals to men they knew they could match or surpass in skill and intelligence. The uniforms they wore were the same, the sacrifices they made no less real, yet the respect, the recognition, and the opportunities they received were starkly unequal. Meanwhile, in other branches of the military, slow but significant changes were beginning to take root. The army, under pressure from civil rights groups and black newspapers, had begun to integrate some of its training programs. Black pilots from the Tuskegee Airmen program were proving their mettle in the skies over Europe and North Africa. The Marine Corps, once closed entirely to black recruits, had finally begun accepting them, though still under segregated conditions. And yet, the Navy clung stubbornly to its traditions, resisting the tide of change. The contradiction was glaring. The United States was engaged in a global war against the ideologies of racial superiority and authoritarianism, yet continued to enforce those very ideals within its own ranks. This hypocrisy was not lost on the world or on black Americans. For many, the experience of serving in the Navy during World War II was a bitter one, marked not only by the dangers of combat but by the persistent sting of inequality. And when the war ended, that legacy did not simply vanish. Black veterans returned home to a nation that had used their labor, praised their service when convenient, but continued to treat them as second-class citizens. The GIBIL, designed to help returning soldiers reintegrate and rebuild their lives, was often applied unequally. Access to education, housing, and employment remained heavily segregated, with black veterans frequently denied the very benefits they had earned through their service. But it was in that post-war era, fueled by the experiences of injustice faced during the conflict, that a new generation of leaders began to rise. The limitations imposed on black sailors during the war sparked not defeat, but determination. They would no longer accept a system that denied them opportunity and dignity. The struggle they faced aboard ships and in naval ports would inform the broader civil rights movement to come. Their stories, once buried beneath headlines of victory, began to surface not as footnotes, but as calls to action. Today, the memory of those men lingers not just in naval archives or war memorials, but in the progress that followed. The integration of the armed forces in 1948, signed by President Truman, did not erase the pain of the past, but it was a step forward, one that acknowledged the truth long known by those who had served in silence. The story of black sailors in World War II is not just a tale of exclusion, it is also one of resilience, quiet resistance, and the unwavering demand for justice. And in remembering them, we are reminded that the fight for equality is not waged in distant lands alone, but often within the very institutions that claim to defend it. When the war finally ended, and the drums of global conflict gave way to the silence of peace, thousands of black soldiers returned home to the United States. They had fought bravely on the beaches of Normandy, in the skies over Europe, and across the islands of the Pacific. They had bled and died in foreign lands under the same flag as their white counterparts. And yet, when they stepped back onto American soil, many were met not with gratitude, but with the cold and enduring sting of racism. Their uniforms might have earned them salutes overseas, but back home, they were reminders of a contradiction too glaring to ignore, a country that demanded loyalty from men it still treated as unequal. The experience of these veterans was a crucible. The war had changed them. In the segregated barracks and the unequal roles assigned to black troops, they had come to understand the full weight of the system they were fighting for. In the military, many had served with distinction despite being relegated to menial or dangerous jobs loading munitions, digging trenches, delivering supplies under fire while being denied the opportunities for advancement routinely offered to white soldiers. Others had broken through those barriers, like the Tuskegee Airmen or the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion, proving time and again their skill, discipline, and courage. These men had not just seen the world, they had seen themselves reflected in it differently. They had earned respect abroad that they had been denied at home. And so, when they came back, something was different. The old routines of segregation, of stepping off sidewalks to let white pedestrians pass, of being turned away from restaurants, schools, and polling booths, these things now burned with a sharper pain. They had risked everything for democracy, yet they were still denied its most basic promises. Their uniforms, once a symbol of unity and sacrifice, became silent protests walking the streets of Jim Crow America. The contradiction between their service and their treatment at home did not fade, it ignited. Many black veterans found themselves at the forefront of a growing resistance. They had experienced dignity, purpose, and camaraderie in the military that made the racial hierarchies of civilian life intolerable. They were no longer content with the role of passive sufferer. They had fought fascism abroad. Now, they would fight injustice at home. In cities like Birmingham, Chicago, and Washington, black veterans became some of the most vocal leaders and participants in civil rights activism. Some joined or founded local chapters of the NAP. Others returned to their communities and began organizing voter registration drives or challenging segregation in public spaces. Many still wore the quiet pride of their service, not as a badge of nationalism, but as a declaration that they had earned the full rights of citizenship, and they would no longer accept anything less. The impact was far-reaching. The presence of these veterans in the early civil rights movement lent the cause a new moral authority. When they spoke about justice, they did so with the voice of those who had faced down tyranny and survived. When they demanded equality, they were not asking, they were asserting. Their credibility, forged in the crucible of war, was unshakable. Their courage, already tested in battle, made them formidable opponents of injustice. One such veteran was Medgar Evers, who served in France during the war and returned home to Mississippi with a renewed sense of mission. He would later become a field secretary for the NAP and one of the most prominent civil rights activists of his time, until his assassination in 1963. Countless others, perhaps less known, took up their own battles across the country fighting housing discrimination, advocating for equal education, and standing up to police brutality. The link between military service and activism was not unique to a few individuals. It was a tide. Across the South, black soldiers returning from World War II were often targeted for violence because they were perceived as a threat to the established racial order. Their very presence in uniform, proud and dignified, challenged the lie of white supremacy. In some towns, they were advised to take off their uniforms as soon as they got home, to avoid provoking white hostility. But many refused. They had earned those uniforms, and they would not be stripped of their dignity. This new generation of veterans helped set the stage for the major civil rights victories of the 1950s and 1960s. Their wartime experiences had created a powerful sense of unity, and their exposure to different parts of the world had broadened their perspectives. They had seen how other nations treated their black citizens, and they returned with a sharper understanding of what was possible and what was intolerable. Perhaps most importantly, they brought with them a new sense of self-worth. They had proven their courage under fire, had fought for a nation that often did not fight for them, and had returned with the unshakable conviction that their lives, their dignity, and their voices mattered. In the long, slow march toward equality, they were no longer willing to wait at the back of the line. Their legacy would echo in the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act. But it began with the quiet defiance of men who returned from war unwilling to accept the world as it was. They came home not just as soldiers, but as harbingers of change. And from the moment their boots touched American soil, the fight for civil rights entered a new and irreversible chapter. In June of 1941, with the winds of global war intensifying and the United States inching closer to full-scale involvement, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802. To many Americans, it may have appeared to be just another wartime directive, but for millions of African Americans, it represented something far more profound, a moment when the federal government, for the first time in history, took a definitive stand against racial discrimination in employment on a national scale. The order prohibited discrimination in the defense industry and in government jobs based on race, creed, color, or national origin, at a time when Black Americans were still living under the weight of Jim Crow laws, and when segregation was the brutal norm in both public and private life. The significance of this action could not be overstated. But Executive Order 8802 did not come from a place of altruism alone. It was the result of strategic pressure, grassroots activism, and the tenacity of civil rights leaders like Philip Randolph. Randolph, a labor organizer and president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, had threatened to lead a mass march on Washington, demanding equal access to jobs and training in the booming defense sector. The threat of tens of thousands of Black Americans descending on the nation's capital at a time of national emergency forced Roosevelt to act. With the stroke of a pen, the order created the Fair Employment Practices Committee (FEPS), tasked with investigating and addressing complaints of racial discrimination. The implications of Executive Order 8802 rippled far beyond the drafting table in the Oval Office. In war plants across the country, Black workers began to see doors crack open, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes violently resisted, but open nonetheless. In cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles, Black men and women began taking up positions in factories that had long excluded them, working on assembly lines, building tanks, aircraft, and munitions. These were not just jobs, they were lifelines, opportunities, and steps toward dignity. They were wages that could feed families, buy homes, and send children to school. They represented something deeper, a claim to equal participation in the national enterprise. Still, the road was anything but smooth. White workers in many industries pushed back against integration, leading to strikes and protests. Tensions exploded into violence in several cities, most notably during the Detroit race riot of 1943, where simmering resentment over housing, jobs, and police brutality boiled over into bloodshed. The FEPS, underfunded and lacking true enforcement power, struggled to bring about real accountability, but its presence alone was a challenge to the status quo. For the first time, Black workers had a federal agency where they could lodge complaints and seek redress. The machinery of government was beginning, however slowly, to acknowledge their grievances. The impact of this policy shift reverberated in the minds of African American soldiers serving overseas. Fighting tyranny abroad while enduring segregation and racism at home created a painful contradiction. For many, the experience of war crystallized a new sense of urgency. They had risked their lives, fought valiantly in foreign lands, and returned home to find that in too many places, nothing had changed, but the war had changed them. They had seen a world beyond America's racial caste system. They had shared trenches with men of different backgrounds. They had felt the dignity of being part of something larger than themselves. The connection between employment, dignity, and civil rights would become a cornerstone of the post-war movement. Veterans who had benefited from wartime employment opportunities came back determined to ensure those gains were not temporary. Organizations like the NAP swelled in membership, fueled by veterans who were no longer willing to wait for justice. They brought with them the discipline, courage, and clarity forged in war. Some became leaders in their communities, others organizers or advocates, but all carried the conviction that the fight for freedom did not end in Europe or the Pacific, it continued at home. Executive Order 8802, though limited in scope and power, had cracked the foundation of employment discrimination and exposed the hollowness of the arguments used to justify exclusion. It had laid the groundwork for future legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and had shown that federal power could be wielded in service of justice. It had also demonstrated the efficacy of direct action of making demands. Organizing collectively, and refusing to accept injustice in silence. And perhaps most importantly, it planted a seed of expectation in the minds of a generation. Young Black Americans saw their parents enter workplaces once barred to them. They saw their elders file complaints, protest unfair treatment, and win small victories. These moments became part of the fabric of their communities, quiet but powerful stories of resistance and change. It was a reminder that the arc of history could bend, not by accident or goodwill, but by pressure, persistence, and vision. In the years that followed, as the civil rights movement took to the streets, the courtroom, and the halls of Congress, the legacy of Executive Order 8802 remained a foundational chapter. It was not a conclusion, but a beginning, a signal that the federal government could be moved to act, that collective action could produce change, and that justice, though delayed, was not beyond reach. As the tides of war surged across Europe, the Allied forces faced a colossal challenge, not just the enemy on the battlefield, but the logistics required to sustain a global war effort. Behind the roaring tanks and advancing infantry, there was another kind of army, one that did not always carry rifles or fly planes, but whose role was no less essential. Among them stood a supply convoy unit, made up predominantly of African American soldiers. Their names seldom made headlines, and their deeds were rarely sung in patriotic ballads. Yet their contributions became the lifeline of the Allied push into Nazi-occupied territories. This majority black unit operated under difficult conditions, sometimes without adequate equipment or recognition, yet carried out their mission with relentless dedication and quiet heroism. They were part of the Red Ball Express, a massive logistical operation created to ensure that fuel, ammunition, and food reached the front lines after the Allied landings in Normandy. When the breakout from the beaches began and Allied forces pushed deep into France, traditional supply lines crumbled under the weight of rapid advancement. Roads were clogged, infrastructure was damaged, and fuel was running critically low. The fate of entire offensives hinged on whether supplies could keep up with the pace of war. That is when the Red Ball Express, manned in large part by black drivers and mechanics, stepped in to fill the gap. Each day, hundreds of trucks thundered down makeshift supply routes carved into war-torn countryside. These convoys drove day and night, often with little rest, facing enemy fire, treacherous terrain, and mechanical failure. Despite segregation and the weight of racial prejudice back home and within the military itself, these soldiers forged ahead, keeping the lifeblood of the Allied armies flowing. They were not only racing against German forces, they were racing against time, against doubt, and against a world that often failed to recognize their worth. What made this even more remarkable was that their efforts came at a time when African Americans were still fighting for the right to be seen as full citizens in their own country. Just months before, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had issued Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in the defense industry. It was a landmark move, driven in part by civil rights leaders who had threatened a massive march on Washington. The order did not end racism in the military or society, but it opened doors for black Americans to enter critical roles in the wartime economy and armed forces. The members of the Red Ball Express were among the first to seize that opportunity and to prove, beyond any doubt, that skill, courage, and patriotism were not confined by race. Their accomplishments also shattered deeply ingrained myths. For years, Military brass had doubted whether black soldiers could perform in high-pressure combat-related operations. Some commanders believed that logistical work was the only area where African American troops could contribute effectively. But as the war wore on and the demands grew fiercer, those old prejudices began to crack. The performance of these units became impossible to ignore. Allied generals praised the efficiency and tenacity of the convoys. In private conversations and public reports, they acknowledged that the forward momentum of the war effort depended heavily on these black troops. In their downtime, if they had any, these men formed tight-knit communities. They fixed trucks by moonlight, shared jokes and memories from back home, and helped one another cope with the constant stress. Some decorated their vehicles with names and slogans, a quiet assertion of identity in a system that too often rendered them invisible. Theirs was a war not only of bullets and borders, but of dignity in everyday battle, to be seen, to be valued, to be free. Yet, even as they risked their lives for freedom abroad, they knew that the war for justice was far from over at home. Letters sent back to families in the American South often reflected a complex blend of pride and pain. They were proud to wear the uniform, to be part of something larger than themselves. But they were painfully aware that returning home might mean going back to second-class status, denied the basic rights they had just helped secure for others in Europe. Still, many believed that their service would mean something, that it would help transform the nation they loved into one that loved them back. In the years following the war, their stories became fuel for the burgeoning civil rights movement. Veterans who had served in these convoys marched in protests, testified before Congress, and stood on the front lines of America's next great struggle. Their wartime experience of rising above bias, of performing under pressure, of holding a fractured system together prepared them for the long road ahead. The legacy of the Red Ball Express and other majority black units stretches far beyond the dusty roads of France. It reaches into every discussion of equality and justice, every lesson about the costs of freedom. They taught the world that valor does not come in a single shade, and that the strength of a nation lies in its willingness to embrace all who are willing to serve. Theirs is a chapter of World War II that can no longer be forgotten, because their struggle was not just to win a war, but to win recognition, equality, and respect. For many of the black men who served during World War II, the end of the conflict did not mark a homecoming to parades, praise, or promises fulfilled. Instead, they returned to a country that was still reluctant to see them as equals. Though they had worn the uniform with pride and had borne the burden of war with dignity, their contributions were often ignored or buried beneath the weight of a segregated society. For years, their names were missing from the history books, their stories untold, and their valor overlooked. Yet, these men, cooks, drivers, engineers, combat medics, supply line operators, and soldiers had laid the groundwork for change. Brick by brick, moment by moment, often in silence and without expectation of reward. It would take decades before the full weight of their sacrifice was acknowledged. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, historians, civil rights activists, and veterans organizations began to push for long overdue recognition. They combed archives, conducted interviews, and gave voice to those who had waited too long in the shadows of history. Stories emerged of men who braved enemy fire without ever being given the chance to serve on equal terms, of units that outperformed expectations despite being under-resourced and marginalized, of quiet heroism in a time when heroism by black Americans was often ignored by the very nation they served. Among these stories were the men of the Tuskegee Airmen, whose aerial prowess broke down myths about black incompetence in combat, the 761st Tank Battalion, which fought with fierce determination on the front lines, and the Red Ball Express drivers, who kept Allied supply lines moving in the face of overwhelming odds. Their courage was not theoretical, it was proven daily under fire, in mud-soaked fields and bullet-riddled skies. And yet, for years, many of them were denied Giebel benefits, excluded from veterans' housing, or buried without military honors. The war may have ended in 1945, but their fight for dignity continued long after the guns fell silent. Recognition began to come in waves, slowly at first, then gathering momentum. Medals were finally awarded, statues erected, and documentaries filmed. Presidents would eventually speak their names aloud, and schools began to teach their stories. But the most profound legacy these veterans left was not just in the medals or speeches, it was in the irreversible moral pressure their service applied to a segregated society. Their presence in the military, their excellence in the face of adversity, challenged America to live up to its own ideals. Their sacrifices created a mirror that the nation could no longer look away from. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the U.S. military, it was not just an act of policy, it was an act born of necessity and conscience, forged in part by the undeniable truth of black heroism during WE. The groundwork had been laid not just by activists or lawmakers, but by ordinary men who had done extraordinary things while wearing the uniform of a country that often refused to see them. Their strength and patience helped open the doors, not only within the military, but also in broader American society, paving the way for the civil rights movement and every moment of progress that followed. Today, as we remember the story of Black Americans in World War II, we are reminded that history is not just the story of battles won or lost on distant shores. It is the story of courage that reshapes the soul of a nation. These veterans may not have set out to change the world, but in serving with honor and integrity, they did just that. They forced America to confront its contradictions, to question its injustices, and to begin the long, unfinished journey toward equality. Their legacy is not just in what they did, but in what they made possible. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most powerful and often overlooked chapters in history. If this story moved you, if it taught you something new, or if you believe it deserves to be heard, please consider giving us a like and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps keep these important stories alive and helps us bring more truth from the shadows into the light. Until next time, take care and good night.